Hey everybody, and welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching part 2 of Early Muslim Expansion, Arab Conquest of Iran and Egypt by Kings and Generals. So, last time we saw the conquest of Ctesiphon and the fall of the Sassanid Empire. You know, the Sassanid Empire was one of the two major players in the region. You had the Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, and the Sassanids. And they have fallen to the expansion of the Caliphate. You know, the Caliphate was not founded that long ago, yet it has already taken down one of the biggest empires of the time. So in this video, we're going to continue to watch the Muslim expansion throughout the region. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. And without any further ado, let's get into this reaction.
We last left the Muslim-Syrian campaign in the aftermath of Abu Ubaidah and Khalid ibn al-Walid's triumph over the Romans at Yarmouk.
Right, so in the last video, as I mentioned, we witnessed the fall of the Sassanids, and now we're going back to one of our other major storylines, which was the Muslim conquest of Syria, where they were fighting against the Romans.
Exhausted from that long 6-day struggle, the Muslims remained camped around Jabiyah for a month, collecting the bounties of war and recuperating their strength. The scant few of Heraclius' warriors who survived the massacre fled north to the relative safety of northern Syria.
Yeah, and obviously the Roman Empire would survive for a long time after this, unlike the Sassanids, but they were dealt a pretty disastrous blow by the Muslims, as we saw, in prior episodes. The Battle of Yarmouk was a really disastrous loss for Heraclius and the Roman Empire, even though they would survive it,
leaving Palestine at the mercy of the Islamic forces. Without an army to check his progress, Abu Ubaidah assembled his generals in October 636 to decide how best to exploit the situation. Some argued for an attack on the strategic linchpin of Caesarea, a coastal fortress whose garrison could be indefinitely reprovisioned by the Roman navy if besieged, but
I mean, that's one of the few advantages that the Romans have had. I mean, the Romans have a lot of advantages, they just haven't been able to leverage them against the Muslim forces, but the Roman naval power and their ability to resupply by the sea has been one of their few advantages against the Muslims that they have been able to use at least somewhat effectively.
Which could also serve as a potential beachhead for a counterattack if not taken. If the Muslims got it, the campaign for Palestine would be over. However, other commanders pointed inland towards a much simpler and symbolically enticing target, Jerusalem. Not only could this isolated city be strangled into submission with relative ease, but the loss of their holiest place would be a crushing blow to Roman Christian morale.
I mean, it would, yeah. That's an intelligent, symbolic target to go for. It's not necessarily, say, a site of military importance, but it is certainly a site of deep religious importance. I mean, to everybody involved, but to the Romans in particular, you know, this is a deeply Orthodox Christian empire. If you were talking about how to characterize the Byzantine Empire, one of the first things you would come across would be their Christian outlook, you know, their deep orthodoxy. And so that is an extremely important site, and having it taken from them, I'm sure it would be very demoralizing. And, you know, maybe a little frightening. I mean, if you're a Christian and your holiest site has just been taken by, you know, these individuals from a new religion, that might shake your faith. You might wonder, why is this happening?
Unable to come to a decision, Abu Ubaidah sent a message to Caliph Umar asking his opinion. The reply was simple: take Jerusalem. So Abu Ubaidah led the Muslim army straight at the holy city. Realizing what was about to happen, Jerusalem's patriarch Sophronius secretly sent the holiest Christian relics, including the True Cross, off to Constantinople by sea. The raiding Arab mobile guard under Khalid reached Jerusalem sometime in November, just before the rest of the army, and this prompted the Roman garrison to pull back inside. Discovering to their chagrin that its fortifications had been reinforced after Yarmouk in anticipation of just such a siege, the 5 commanders, Abu Ubaidah, Khalid, Yazid, Amr, and Shirabil, nevertheless blocked off all passage in and out of Jerusalem. This state of affairs continued for 4 months in a relatively uneventful siege, of which few details survive. The situation in the city must have become unbearable though, because in March 637, Sophronius offered to surrender Jerusalem if Umar himself came and personally signed the treaty with him.
Wow.
When these terms became known, Shirabil suggested that Khalid, whose appearance was relatively similar to that of the Caliph, should impersonate their leader and secure a quick surrender.
That is weird.
However, this attempt at deception failed the next morning.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very strange thing to do. Plus, I feel like Umar might be a little insulted if he found out about that. Like, oh, Khalid, this rather ambitious general, you've tried to impersonate me and take on my role while signing a treaty. You could definitely take that a certain kind of way.
Because Khalid was far too well known in the Levant by this point. When it did, Abu Ubaidah instead dispatched a message to Medina explaining the situation. A few weeks later, having made the long journey from Arabia, Caliph Umar arrived near Jerusalem.
Wow.
Khalid and Yazid greeted him, both dressed in fine silk clothing, but this annoyed Umar, a firm enemy of luxury and a proponent of the Spartan way of life. Seeing his generals in such a state of apparent excess, the Caliph picked up some pebbles and threw them at the 2 stunned men, shouting, "Shame on you that you greet me in this fashion. It is only in the last 2 years that you have eaten your fill."
Damn.
The Caliph's rage.
I mean, Umar's had a little bit of tension with his generals up until this point, as he tries to establish his base of power and sort of reform the military and the state, but that's a pretty direct condemnation of their behavior.
Which was quickly sated when Khalid and Shirabil revealed that they were in fact still carrying armor and weapons beneath their fine outer garments. Drama aside, he quickly got down to business and negotiated with Sophronius, with the result that Jerusalem was opened to the Muslims by late April. It is said that the pact between Umar and Sophronius recognized Christians as a protected people with the right to practice their own religion in return for the jizya. But this covenant of Umar is probably apocryphal. Now that the holy city of Christendom was in his hands, the Caliph conferred with his commanders and then went back to Arabia. The Syrian army then split into thirds, with Amr and Shirabil moving to reoccupy and secure Palestine, Yazid besieging Caesarea, while Khalid and Abu Ubaidah moved to begin the conquest of northern Syria.
And just another note on the conquest of Jerusalem, because they didn't really talk about this aspect of it, and I don't want to skip over it without giving it too much time, but I mean, that would be a major loss for the Romans, and that could definitely cause a crisis of faith. I know that as time went on, and as the Muslims conquered more Roman territory and more holy sites important to the Romans, a lot of people, went back to the Bible, questioned their faith, and wondered, why are we being punished this way? What is the problem? Of course, there could be the train of thought, and of course this is how the Muslims viewed it, which is, they were the chosen people, not the Christians. Islam is the way to go. Now, if you're a devoted Orthodox Christian, of course you're not going to view it that way, and many Orthodox thinkers viewed it as some sort of punishment for their own sins. Our territory is being stripped away from us. Our holy sites are being taken because of our sinful behavior. And there was a lot of that talk over the years. There was some thought about, because the Romans viewed themselves very much as the chosen people, the inheritors of the Christian legacy. There was some thought about, is that still true? Has something changed? Do we not have God's favor anymore? So I do think it's an interesting thing, the sort of intellectual discussion and religious debate that these, on-the-ground military events would produce back in Constantinople, because obviously this whole conflict is very charged with religious ideology on both sides.
With the situation in the region seemingly hopeless after the Yarmouk disaster, Emperor Heraclius sailed from Antioch and withdrew back into Anatolia, intent on consolidating Byzantine military strength and protecting the remainder of his empire. Once the ship departed, it is said that Heraclius said the words, "Farewell, a long farewell to Syria, my fair province. You are an enemy's now. Peace be with you, O Syria. What a beautiful land you will be for the enemy's hands." Despite this effective abandonment, some of the Roman garrisons were still determined to resist the Arab advance. From Jerusalem, a 17,000-strong force under Khalid and Abu Ubaidah marched unopposed to Damascus, and then even further north to Emesa.
You might wonder why Heraclius doesn't put up more of a fight. One, we just saw what happened to the Sassanids. That was a massive empire, and even mustering what resources they could, they were unable to resist the Muslim onslaught. Same thing with the Romans. Sure, it's a massive empire, but Heraclius simply doesn't have the ability to gather up all the resources that the empire has to offer and strike at the Muslim forces. I mean, at the Battle of Yarmouk, he gathered up what he could, and he failed. Now, he has to go back and consolidate his power base, because he also risks losing support if he's spending too many resources in some faraway provinces. Constantinople's not going to be very happy. So, because one, the empire really doesn't have the resources to do so, and because two, Heraclius needs to consolidate his own position. I mean, remember, it wasn't that long ago that the Romans were in a fight for their lives against the Persians. They only just saved their empire from Persian domination. So, they really don't have too much more to give at this point. I'm not sure Heraclius even could reconquer the Middle East or Syria, even if he really went for it. And if he really went for it, he'd probably be risking his own position as emperor.
From there, Khalid was dispatched with his elite mobile guard to Chalcis, modern Kinnisrin, but was intercepted on a plain at nearby Hazir by 7,000 men under the town's Roman commander, Menes. He deployed his limited forces in 3 divisions, a center and 2 wings, placing himself at the forefront. Khalid charged with his Arab cavalry, and soon enough a fearsome mounted engagement was underway. After only a short amount of time, however, Menas was slain amid heavy fighting, and his troops, who loved their general, went wild with fury. Despite their numerical inferiority, the Roman troops matched the Muslims pound for pound in the head-on clash, pushing...
And that's pretty impressive. You're up against Khalid and a cavalry force. If you can manage to push back, that's quite impressive.
...them back a little, but committing themselves too much. To exploit the opportunity, Khalid detached a unit of cavalry from one of his wings and led it around the Byzantine line, attacking his enemy from the rear and defeating them.
Of course.
It is said that not a single Roman survived this engagement at Hazir.
Jesus. Brutal.
Following this victory, in June 637, Khalid moved on Chalcis itself, where the garrison was stubbornly fortified in the town's citadel. Rather than launching an assault, the Muslim general merely demanded those inside and the defenders surrender, which they did soon after. Abu Ubaidah rejoined Khalid at this point, and the pair moved north to Aleppo, where they defeated a minor Byzantine force commanded by Joachim in a pitched battle outside the city.
Yeah, this is no surprise. The combined forces of the Roman Empire could not defeat Muslim expansion in the region. There's no way that a couple of random garrisons that want to hold out are going to be able to do anything.
Like at Chalcis, the Romans retreated into their fortifications, a hilltop citadel outside Aleppo itself. Joachim sallied out a few times in an attempt to break the siege, but failed, and by October 637, the city was in Arab hands. The greatest Roman city in Syria, Antioch, was now close. To precipitate an attack on it, Ubaidah sent a strike force to deal with the garrison at Azaz in the north, so that no Roman units could hit them from the flank as they were taking Antioch. This was done swiftly, and when the strike force returned, Ubaida's advance on Antioch began. When the Muslim army was 12 miles from one of the urban jewels of the Byzantine Empire, they were met at an iron bridge over the Orontes River by a powerful Roman army who had come from Antioch. Although the details of this Battle of the Iron Bridge are also unknown, it is clear that Khalid used his mobile guard to superb effect, crushing...
That's probably a good guess. If Khalid's involved and you don't know the details, you're thinking, yeah, Khalid probably used his mobile guard to win the battle, as he almost always seems to do.
the Romans in a battle whose casualties were only exceeded by Ajnadayn and Yarmouk.
Wow.
In the wake of thousands of fleeing enemy soldiers, the Muslims approached and besieged Antioch. But taking the illustrious capital of the East was an anticlimax. Only a few days into Abu Ubaida's investment, October 30th, the weakened city surrendered on terms, and its defenders were permitted to withdraw north unmolested. Having cleaved the Eastern Roman Empire into two disconnected pieces, Abu Ubaidah dispatched Khalid on a daring cavalry raid across the Taurus Mountains and into the Tarsus region.
Yeah, so they're now getting pretty deep into the empire. I mean, so far we've been talking about Roman borderlands. Now, very important borderlands, the Levant, the Holy Land. That's certainly an extremely important region to the Romans. But now, Khalid is actually piercing pretty deep into the heart of the Roman Empire. If he goes much further, then it's going to start being a serious threat.
While the Supreme Commander himself thrust south down the Mediterranean coast, capturing seaports such as Laodicea, Gibala, Antarados, and Tripoli, making it impossible for Emperor Heraclius to use the superior Roman navy to bring armies into the Levant.
Smart.
Although fighting in the area was far from over, by late 637, most generals of the Syrian campaign settled down to rule their respective regions as governors. At Hulwan, Yazdegerd III was still eager to salvage his crumbling empire after the loss of Ctesiphon.
Oh, okay. I kind of thought we were going to be done with the Sassanids. Of course, they still have a lot of territory, but they were pretty, roundly defeated last time. But, I guess we'll see Yazdegerd's attempts to save his empire.
To do this, he ordered the main Persian army under Miran and Khurizad to halt their retreat and turn to face the invaders near Jalula. Armies attempting to push north past the riverside town were forced to march through a narrow gap between the Tigris's Diyala tributary to the west side and an area of barely passable broken ground to the east. If Miran's 20 to 30,000 could hold this position, the remainder of northern Suwad and Sassanid territory east of the Zagros Mountains would be unassailable. With the aim of converting Jalula into an impenetrable fortress able to resist any enemy thrust, Miran immediately started digging in.
I'm curious to see how this goes because I'm a lot less familiar with the Sassanids than I am the Romans. I'm a lot more familiar with Roman history, Roman territory. And so when they talk about Muslim conquests in Roman territory, I can kind of orient myself and understand how big of a deal it is. I have less of an understanding with the Sassanids, but it does seem that kind of their heartland, their capital was already taken. And that region, which seems to be the most important region, was pretty close to the border. And so now, basically the Persian court is on the run. They're retreating back into the mountains. But perhaps, I think the equivalent would, of course, be if Constantinople was conquered and then the Byzantine court retreated. But that would be just disastrous. There would be no recovering from that. But perhaps Ctesiphon was less important in the grand scheme of things. Regardless, this does seem like a truly desperate last stand from the Persians who, the Sassanid court has been kicked back and back and back, kicked out of their capital. Now they've got virtually nothing left. They've got a lot of territory, but seems like their most important territory has already been claimed.
a ditch was excavated 3 miles to the south, which connected the broken ground to the river, blocking the gap. Behind this trench were a number of other fortifications, artillery, and thousands of Persian archers, while in front were placed an array of wooden anti-cavalry caltrops. Recruits were mustered, armed, and trained from the local area, and provisions were gathered from around the nearby countryside. Jalula was to be a crucial battle.
Okay.
The moment Sassanid defensive works began around Jalula, word reached Sa'd in Ctesiphon that this was happening. As the Muslim general was just as keen to seize the fertile northern Suwad as his Persian enemies were to keep a hold of it, and wanting to push the defensive frontier eastward, Sa'd sent his nephew, Hashim bin Utbah, with 12,000 troops to reduce the Persian position. In order to prevent reinforcement or retreat, Sa'd also dispatched 5,000 men to deal with Persian governor Intak's garrison at Mosul. After several attempts at taking that city by storm, Muslim spies managed to secure the defection of a Christian Arab contingent in a betrayal which led to the fall of Mosul.
I mean, this is also something we're seeing from the Sassanids that has not necessarily been true for the Romans, at least not at this point, is that there have been a lot of desertions, a lot of Persians switching sides from the Sassanids to the Caliphate. We haven't seen nearly as much of that from the Romans, but the Sassanids seem to be dealing with a pretty serious loyalty problem at this point.
The main force heading for Jalula during March 637, Hashim brought with him many companions of Muhammad, as well as the ever-ferocious Kaka ibn Amr. Also in the Muslim ranks were several thousand Persian troops, along with Sassanid officers who had joined them after Ctesiphon.
Yeah.
When the Arabs and their Persian units approached the Jalula Gap after a day's march from the former Sassanid capital, Hashim constructed his camp and deployed along the southern arc of Miran's protective trench, unwilling to launch an outright assault against it. So the situation remained in this manner for many months, during which reinforcements, provision, and money were channeled into the fortified city from Hulwan, where Emperor Yazdegerd was continuously rallying additional forces.
Okay, it looks like, the Sassanids have lost their capital and sort of their heartland, but they are pooling their remaining resources and shoving them into this one city for sort of a last stand. They may have lost their capital, but they're trying to protect the rest of their empire from the Caliphate's forces. I guess we'll see if they're successful. I think not, given how things have gone so far, but I guess we'll see.
Aware that his situation was only going to worsen with time, Hashim ordered several attempts at storming the fortified ditch. Despite the disconcerting failure of Miran's wooden caltrops to stop Arab cavalry, Persian missile troops managed to overwhelm and repel these attacks. Afterwards, the Sassanids replaced the wooden obstacles with more effective iron ones. Demoralized due to their lack of success in breaking the Persian line, the Muslims ceased offensive actions for a while, and that gave Miran an opportunity of his own. Utilizing the constant steady stream of reinforcements coming his way, the Persian general began launching sorties against Hashim's positions, inflicting losses and gaining confidence as he did.
This is actually pretty impressive. I mean, the battle's not nearly close to over yet, but we're actually seeing the Persians taking some initiative, going on the offense, and having a bit of success against the Muslim forces. This is a rare sight.
Although the Muslim army was easily able to fight up to 80 of these attacks off when they arrived and pushed Miran back into his fortifications repeatedly, there was still no way to break the deadlock. With little other option, Hashim sent word back to Ctesiphon that he required reinforcements.
It's funny that now the Muslim forces are sending word back to Ctesiphon, when of course that was once the Sassanid capital. No longer.
Sa'd initially sent 600 infantry and 400 cavalry to bolster the army at Jalula, but this total was barely enough to replace the losses suffered during 8 months of battle and light siege. So soon after, another 500 cavalry reinforcements were dispatched, which included many competent Arab tribal chiefs who had fought against the Caliphate in the Ridda Wars. The Persians, having been themselves reinforced by Yezdegerd and emboldened by Muslim inability to break their defences, now decided to go on the attack before Hashim was further reinforced. Miran also realised that simply waiting wasn't going to win him the battle. The only way to make the Muslim invaders leave was to inflict a decisive defeat on them.
Yeah.
Deployment for an assault began with haste. Such Sassanid preparations for a major attack could not be concealed, and it immediately attracted Hashim's attention. This state of affairs was, however, also favourable to the Muslims, who were utterly sick and tired of sitting helplessly outside Miran's fortifications. So,
Alright, so both sides are ready for, a head-on-head battle. Like I said, I'm surprised that the Sassanids are able to put up so much of a fight, but it seems like we're getting another major decisive battle. I kind of thought, when we saw the conquest of Ctesiphon, that was the last stand of the Sassanid court, but seems like we're getting another last stand here.
to facilitate a pitched battle, Hashim withdrew his forces a short distance to the south and allowed his Persian adversaries to cross their own entrenchments, thereafter arraying for battle opposite. The actual order of battle at Jalula is obscure to us, but we do know that two former apostate chiefs, Amr bin Madi Karib of the Zubayd family and Taleha bin Kalewad of the Banu Asad, were given command of the cavalry and infantry respectively. Now that the Persian rear was anchored by their own ditch, the only direction to move was forwards, and that is just what happened.
Yep.
At Miran's command,
I mean, I understand they wanted to go on the offensive, but, they are anchored by their own defenses. So if they end up getting continuously pushed back, they're gonna kind of get stuck and trapped by their own defensive line, which seems a little dangerous. But I suppose if they wanted a big battle, that was sort of an inevitability.
the Battle of Jalula proper began with a full-scale Sassanid attack along the entire front, with archers and javeliniers loosing their projectiles before melee troops made contact. The charge struck with devastating impact, but Hashim's Muslims nevertheless resisted stalwartly for a time, refusing to give an inch of ground. This didn't last long, however, as the ferocious assault, fired up by constant shouts swearing vengeance for Qadisiyah and Ctesiphon, began punching small holes in various places along the Muslim line.
Wow.
These successful thrusts endangered the integrity of the entire Muslim front, and it was immediately clear to Hashim that the danger of total collapse was very real and perhaps imminent. To resolve the problem, Sa'd's nephew rode along his buckling line to speak inspirationally to those units which were weakening, proclaiming that if they persisted, this was the last battle they would have to fight.
I guess at this point, sure, the Persians have been fighting for their homeland this whole time, but now they're fighting for revenge, and I guess that's a sort of special type of motivation, and they are seemingly really going for it. They've really got that fire within them to keep pushing forward and fight back against the Muslim invaders. Will it be enough to win them their homeland back? Well, no, in the long run. Will it be enough to win them this battle? I don't know. We'll have to see.
The present clash between Sassanid and Muslim troops became increasingly brutal, as both sides' missile units ran out of javelins and arrows, instead taking up melee weapons and charging into the slog themselves. Both armies had units battered into non-functionality by the extended fighting, but when this happened, the Persians were able to replace them, while Hashim had no such luxury. Because of this numerical disadvantage, one Islamic unit gave way and routed to the rear at about noon, leaving a potentially fatal vacuum in the Muslim line. However, either because Miran did not notice the opportunity, or due to his soldiers' exhaustion, an attack on the position was not ordered, and Hashim scraped together some men to fill the position. Witnessing the flight of this unit, Kaka rode back and restored order, returning it to the battle. almost unbearable desert heat and the brutal fighting led to the Persians halting their offensive just after this, and both sides disengaged.
A brutal slog. I mean, it really looks like it points that the Muslim line was going to break, and the Sassanids were going to finally have a victory under their belt, but not quite. And I'm always reticent to say, well, it looks like the Sassanids are getting the upper hand, because in several of the battles before, the Romans or the Sassanids have seemed to have the advantage, but the Caliphate's forces always managed to come back and defeat them in the end. Now, in this case, of course, this was just a brutal slog. We still have a stalemate. I would say the Muslims are in a worse position at this point because they seem to have taken some pretty heavy losses, but it could go either way still.
After a short rest, Miran planned to keep piling on the pressure, but Hashim had other plans. As his enemy had before, the Muslim general ordered his warriors to charge across the entire front, spoiling Miran's assault, and initiating another grueling clash which lasted for over an hour without a decisive moment. Just before sunset, however, the wind whipped up and a storm rolled in from the south, a weather phenomenon which affected the Persians more than the hardy desert nomads.
Yeah, I mean, the Muslim forces, many of whom were, Arabs who had served, back in the desert, would have been far more used to this sort of weather than the Persian forces. Although, of course, the Muslim forces do contain some Persians at this point, but it's still primarily Arab soldiers.
As the wind was now at the Muslims' back, granting them momentum in the advance, Hashim signaled Kaka ibn Amr to embark on a maneuver they had prepared beforehand, while his general kept Miran occupied in the front.
Cavalry flanking maneuver, the key to many a Muslim victory in this era.
The buccaneering Arab warrior took a regiment away from the left wing unnoticed and managed to circle around the Persian rear. Instead of attacking immediately, Kaka left most of his outflanking force in a sheltered area to stop them being seen, then took a few outriders and a man with an incredibly strong voice close to the main crossing point over the Persian trench. Following the call, multiple things happened at once. First, the Muslim army, deceived by their own into believing that their general had reached the trench alone, attacked with renewed vigor and peak morale. At the same time, worried that large numbers of Muslims were now behind them, individual Sassanid units who did not have a strategic overview of the field panicked, lost cohesion, but did not.
Yeah, the Muslims are playing a bit of a mind game here. They are simultaneously boosting the morale of their troops, who are now going to push even harder, and they are playing some mind games with the Sassanids, who are now worried that there is a substantial Muslim force behind them waiting to crash down upon them. And to be fair, there is there is a fairly sizable cavalry force that is ready to rush in and flank the Sassanid force.
Not break. The coup de grace was administered by Kaka himself, whose flanking force charged upon hearing the shout, whirling into Miran's flank like a thunderbolt. At the impact, the Sassanid line was rolled up before being encircled entirely. Still, however, the Persian forces were stalwart, refusing to collapse utterly despite their unwinnable situation. Muslim forces continued attacking the encircled but still resistant forces of Miran all day, losing troops as they did. However, the Sassanid soldiers...
it seems hopeless for the Persians at this point, but I will say that is a pretty impressive stand from the Sassanid troops. Despite how hopeless their position is, they're really just fighting till the end. And they're holding out a remarkably long period of time. It really shows you sort of the drive and toughness of these soldiers.
Were only human. At sunset, as the sky began to darken, everything fell apart and the Persians routed, only to be cut down as they fled.
Of course.
The great mass of them, driven into the ditch and their own iron stakes by Hashim's army, perished terribly.
Yeah.
Up to half of the Sassanid army perished at Jalula, while the remainder, including the town garrison, fled in the direction of Hulwan, and the town itself fell in December 637. Shortly after, Kako rode in pursuit of the retreating enemy and defeated them, first at Kenikine, before besieging and capturing Hulwan in January 638. Emperor Yazdegerd retreated beyond the Zagros. When Kaka subsequently wrote to the Caliph asking permission to operate deeper in Persia, Umar would have absolutely none of it.
Really?
Forbidding the operation, he replied, "I wish that between the Suad and the hills were a wall, which would prevent them from getting to us and prevent us from getting to them. The fertile Suad is sufficient for us, and I prefer the safety of the Muslims to the spoils of war."
Interesting. I mean, that wall doesn't exist, so there is the chance that the Sassanids could launch a counterattack, but I do understand what he's saying. He's making the point that, look, you know, we're conquering their land, and we've already conquered the most fertile area that they have. We've got their best land. There's no point to keep going. And I mean, he's probably right. The Sassanid court is still alive, but I'm not sure how much of an empire they have at this point. It seems like they've really lost their main power base and their most fertile land, which is now held by the Caliphate.
Expansion to the east was halted, but the Muslims were now looking towards the jewel in the Roman imperial crown, Egypt.
Ooh.
Despite winning all of Syria and Iraq for Islam in a series of stunning victories, the Caliphate's military situation remained unstable. Fierce Persian resistance continued in the mountains to the northeast, while Emperor Heraclius was hindering the Muslim advance as much as he could. To stall for time, while he created an impenetrable dead zone between the Anatolian plain and enemy-occupied Syria, Heraclius sent envoys to his Christian Arab allies in the Jazeera area, requesting that they attack the Muslim army in Syria. They obeyed the emperor's orders, crossing the Euphrates and arriving outside Emesa in March 638, where Abu Ubaidah had concentrated his forces to meet them.
So, I mean, you can see that Heraclius is now trying a lot of different things to stop the Muslim advance, which is getting pretty serious. I mean, he's already lost a head-on-head battle at Yarmouk, so he's not doing that again. Plus, he really can't afford to lose that many troops again. So, now he's trying to pull out all the stops to just halt the Muslim advance step by step as they keep moving north and west. Eventually into Anatolia, that's what he's trying to prevent. And of course, the Muslim forces have already conquered the capital of the Sassanid Empire, and they now, own a pretty large amount of the western portion of the Sassanid Empire.
However, Umar, in his typically hands-on fashion, reacted to this news by sending orders to Sa'd in Persia for 3 columns to invade Jazeera from Iraq. When this group of Muslim warriors launched their attack and began plundering, the Christian Arabs retreated. In the aftermath, forces under Sa'd turned and annexed Jazeera completely. At the same time, multiple mounted raiding parties were sent by Abu Ubaidah into Roman lands. Khalid, the commander of one of these contingents, captured Marash in autumn 638 and hauled vast quantities of loot back to his base at Kinisrin.
See, so the Muslims still haven't penetrated too far into the Roman heartland, but as you can see, they're now sort of hovering around eastern Anatolia. That's going to be really dangerous for the Roman Empire.
However, Khalid wasn't a man accustomed to hoarding wealth, routinely distributing his personal share of battle spoils to others.
Nice.
On one occasion, after his raid on Heraclius' lands, an Arab chief and excellent poet, Ashaz bin Qais, recited a beautiful piece for Khalid, and in return was given 10,000 dirhams. Unknown to the poet's benefactor, this act of generosity was in fact to herald the end of his peerless military career.
Really?
Caliph Umar had been concerned about Khalid for years by 638, specifically that his personal brilliance and constant victories were enticing the Muslims to worship him rather than God.
And I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Khalid has been a very successful general. He's clearly a leader that people want to follow. So that's a fair concern. And I would also say, if we look at this realistically, I'm sure that Umar, he not only has the religious concern, but he probably also is concerned for his own leadership. He's obviously got the religious concerns about Khalid's, reputation and his leadership, but I'm sure he's also worried that Khalid could serve as a rival to himself. Umar's been trying to establish his own base of power. He's really been getting involved in all aspects of governance of the empire. He's been trying to reform things, and Khalid represents, I think, a big challenge to his power. Not to mention that this whole setup, the caliphate, Islam itself, they're not that old at this point. Their foundations are not that strongly rooted, and so someone like Khalid, if given the opportunity, could definitely really change things up, do things his way, change how things are operated, put himself at the top of the pack, and perhaps even be worshipped. So yeah, I can see why Umar is concerned with Khalid's growing reputation. He could be a threat to Umar's position, he could be a threat to the caliphate itself, and of course that's tied up with the religious aspect. He could be a threat to Islam as it existed at that point.
So when Umar received reports of his general's extravagance, Umar used it as an excuse to dismiss the Sword of Islam from his post and bring him to Medina.
Aww.
When the two formidable men came face to face, the Caliph spoke the words, "You have done, and no man has done as you have done, but it is not people who do, it is Allah who does." After this, Khalid left Arabia for Chalcis, where he lived just 4 more unhappy, unremarkable years before finally passing away in 642.
Damn. That's kind of a shame. I mean, he had a great career. Throughout this whole series, he has probably been one of my favorite individuals to follow. His skill, his talents, he's just been really impressive. And he has been really one of the most important, obviously one of the most important generals, but also one of the most important sort of inventors of the tactics of this era. The use of cavalry, the flanking maneuvers, that was really all him. Of course, that stuff existed before, and it's taken from, nomadic tactics and taken from Arab tribes. I'm not saying he invented them, but he really used them to his advantage in a very impressive way to win many victories against the Persians and the Romans. So it's kind of sad to see him go in such an ignoble way. He was left to live a couple of sad years before dying off. But that doesn't take away from his very impressive track record.
As the undefeated victor of hundreds of clashes leaves our story, another bold but historically unappreciated Arab general enters the limelight.
Okay.
That was the 48-year-old Amr ibn Alas, who won distinction during the battles at Ajnadain, Yarmouk, and many others. When Abu Ubaidah appointed the conquered regions to his subordinates, Amr received all of Palestine. Upon moving into the area, he forced the surrender of Gaza and several other Roman garrisons which had remained unconquered after the fall of Jerusalem. In early 639, plague spread rapidly throughout the Levant. The Arabs, unaccustomed to this kind of terrible disease because of their nomadic lifestyle, died in the thousands.
Yeah, and as was said in that little speech box there, the Romans have faced this before, the world has faced this before, and it was absolutely devastating. Just a really destructive, deadly plague, a really terrible thing to face, and definitely really damaging for any state or empire affected by it.
Including generals Yazid, Shurabil, and Abu Ubaidah himself.
Wow. Well, that definitely opens up some opportunities for aspiring young generals.
It is worth noting that upon Yazid's death, his younger brother Muawiyah was appointed as governor in his place. Amr, who survived, was given command of the army, and this gave him a golden opportunity to propose an idea to the Caliph.
Alright, and we're going to end it here. Next time, we will see what idea is being proposed to the Caliph. Where are we going next? They already kind of hinted where we're going next, but that's where we'll go next time. If you guys enjoyed this one, I'd appreciate it if you would check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.